Ukrainian Nazi fallacy. Because of faulty generalization, country X deserves to be militarily invaded, occupied, lose self sovereignty, and become subject to imperialism. An example that might be more familiar to Westerners: because of Islamic terrorists, Iraq deserved to be militarily invaded, occupied, lose self sovereignty, and become subject to imperialism. However, in this example, it's because of Nazis that Ukraine deserves to be militarily invaded, occupied, lose self sovereignty, and become subject to imperialism. And while some might say we should negotiate for peace or cease sending financial and military support to Ukraine, the default outcome is Ukraine being invaded, occupied, and losing self sovereignty. Of course, the voices most often left out of these discussions are those of the people most directly involved, and Ukrainians overwhelmingly do not support territorial concessions. However, if you've been on ostensibly left wing media, then there's no doubt you've seen something like this. Or like this or that. See, it's actually US liberals, something like this. It's NATO. It's actually Democrats. Flint. I think even Bernie Sanders is involved somehow. So what's the problem? It's not as if mainstream media wasn't publishing articles about this a few years ago, and there really are far-right ultranationalists in Ukraine. Well, absolutely nothing is wrong with that. Far-right forces should be criticized everywhere in every country, including Ukraine. However, generalizing the nation of Ukraine and Ukrainian people as a whole as quote unquote Nazis just propaganda to demonize the population, justifying their death in war. This fallacy is meant solely to justify Russia's revanchist neocolonial invasion and has nothing to do with ultranationalist groups, or as Putin might say, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. It also, inadvertently or not, spreads genocide speech against the population fighting for its survival. And this can be a little complicated due to history, but Timothy Sergestev makes it fairly easy for us. In an article he wrote, which was published by RIA, Russian state media, he said that denazification of Ukraine includes the majority of Ukrainians, not just soldiers on the battlefield. In case you missed that, Russian state media said it's necessary to target most of the people in Ukraine, which means civilians and the concept of Ukraine itself. This sentiment isn't relegated to state news channels. Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, tweeted that Ukraine will simply disappear because it's a Nazi regime run by America that even the quote unquote Polacks don't take as a valid country. Just as a note, Poland was the first NATO country to provide Ukraine fighter jets and sign memorandums on reconstruction and joint munition production, among other aid. He then goes on to suggest Ukrainians who believe in the country called Ukraine are blood-sucking parasites and degenerate, which is all fascistic rhetoric, something to understand about Russian propaganda and chauvinism. Fascism has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or racism per se, and instead generally means anything of Western influence. That's how ultranationalist far-right paramilitaries from Russia can post seemingly hypocritical messages about defeating quote-unquote Nazis in Ukraine. How would this conversation go without the Ukrainian Nazi fallacy? Well, a good faith critique would explain all of this in full modern and historical context, but doing that ruins the narrative. Therefore, fallacy is used in bad faith to manufacture consent for war. And what do we mean when we say good faith? Well, honesty, sincerity of intention. An example: this brochure has been published in good faith. And what do we mean when we say bad faith? Well, that means people are engaging in discussion while being dishonest about their intentions, facts, or framing of content. If the critique were actually about Nazis, then it would be applied to both Russia and Ukraine without invalidating Ukraine's right to self-defense from an invading force. And believe me, there's no shortage of ultranationalist fascists and Nazis who are fighting on the Russian side of this conflict. In fact, some of these ostensibly left-wing accounts contradict Putin's own omissions about funding these groups. They can't even keep up with the propaganda fast enough because they aren't operating in good faith to begin with. Even the initial leader of the pro Russian forces in Ukraine was a member of neo Nazi Russian National Unity. He also made posts and gave interviews in which he discussed the extermination and liquidation of Ukraine and Ukrainian people. You will not find any of that in the so called left accounts promoting the Ukrainian Nazi fallacy because they are operating in bad faith and have no issue ignoring other ultranationalists or dehumanizing their victims if it makes their propaganda more convincing to well meaning Western anti fascists and activists. Then there's the government of the Russian Federation itself, a term used to describe the traditionalist, Christo fascist regime that censors or imprisons dissent and opposition is Russism. It broadly applies to the roughly 24 years of Putin's regime. The fallacy is promoting state propaganda from this very government, which is somewhat ironic coming from supposedly left spaces. And the idea of Ukro Nazi is mainly used by chauvinist Russian pro war forces, but ironically, sometimes by misguided Western leftists as well. When every Ukrainian is a Nazi for holding opinions, beliefs, or goals contrary to the Russian government, then all Ukrainians and the nation of Ukraine itself is legitimized for attack. This means civilians, infrastructure, and meaningful sovereignty. And let's be clear that those Russian Nazis and ultranationalists have taken credit for the war in eastern Ukraine themselves. Without those forces, there would be no war today. Let's also not forget that actual anti fascists have been tortured and detained in Russia, while others have fought on the Ukrainian side. Meanwhile, protesters in Russia are forced into military conscription. The Ukrainian Nazi fallacy justifies Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine. It conflates the existence of ultranationalist groups in Ukraine with Ukrainian sovereignty. It diverts all critique away from Russia, its forces, and its practices. It generalizes denazification to the idea of Ukraine itself, aka genocide. There's no solidarity of victims of actual fascistic violence unless it serves a purpose of specific propaganda. Promoting the Ukrainian Nazi fallacy has nothing to do with being anti fascist, as many anti fascists have volunteered on the Ukrainian side of this conflict. It is instead propaganda. And this propaganda is used to manufacture justification and consent for needless war, sometimes, ironically, in the guise of anti war rhetoric.